But it's a clever tactic, because if you think, in 2019, Labour lost a lot of their seats that they had had since basically the seat was created, all under Boris's kind of vision for the North, if we're specifically talking about the Red Wall. And so Keir can't be sneering at those people, because he needs them to come back and vote for him. He needs to win them round to his argument. So yes, there was considerably less kind of finger pointing and blaming, and a lot more kind of story around it, to make people also, I think, you know, oh, this story kind of resonates with me, I've got a similar experience. Oh, okay, so he understands where I'm coming from, he understands what my day-to-day life is like.
We're back for our third and final instalment of Behind the Politics Party Conference Season Special by taking a look at the Labour Party conference this week, having gone into both the Conservative and the Lib Dem conferences over the last fortnight, and before we return to our usual form of interviews with veterans in politics, I've got Lydia back on the sofa in our home to have a bit of a look at what has gone on this week at the Labour Party conference. And of course, we're going to have a bit of a deep dive into Sir Keir Starmer's speech too. But Lydia, you all right?
Good, thanks. Yeah, how are you?
Yeah, well, you know, busy. But getting this podcast is always a highlight of the week for me, because it gives us an opportunity to really dive into what's going on. Now, before we do that, I would really like to acknowledge what is going on in the world at the moment. No matter where you look, there seems to be just despair, particularly amongst civilians affected by conflict, something I know all too personally from experience. And I think it would be remiss of us not to just acknowledge that before we go on to talk about what's happening in the political world. And of course, that was something that Sir Keir Starmer picked up on in his speech, in that condemnation of Hamas, which was an interesting turn of events given the linkages that the parties had in the past under its previous leader, Jeremy Corbyn. But that's all I'm going to have to say about that. Let's go straight into the party conference then, Lydia.
Yes.
Is there anything of note really that you saw stylistically that stood out across the whole conference? There was perhaps a bit of a difference from what we'd seen at Lib Dems and Conservative.
Yes, so traditionally the leader's speech is the final kind of closing mark of every single party conference. We saw it with the Lib Dems, we saw it with the Conservatives, year in, year out. It's the last thing. Yet Sir Keir decided to do his speech on Tuesday with a full day of conference yet to go, and they're finishing up on the NHS and education rather than the leader's speech, which is an interesting turn of events.
Yeah, and pretty bold as well, because that obviously opens it up to media scrutiny as well, because you've got the nation's media all gathered at conference and they're there ready to pounce on him, book interviews in the day after him giving his keynote speech. And for me, that shows an element of confidence as well, a marked change perhaps from we've seen the nervousness of him in the past. So that was definitely interesting. I also like to pick on one thing as well that I noticed is that with Rishi Sunak, he kind of kept all the sweeties to himself and saved lots of things, both good and bad, right up until his speech. But with Sir Keir Starmer, you saw the prominence, kind of a parity across his shadow cabinet in policy announcements, whereas all we saw with the Conservative conference, by contrast, was the noise of certain wings of the party, and some even touted it as leadership campaigns from the likes of Suella Braverman.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not too sure about that, but there was definitely more love to be shared across the shadow cabinet, was there not? There
was, yes. It was, as you say, I mean, I think the economy and Rachel Reeves was kind of the headline act for the majority of the conference. But every single policy area, they're linking it back to the economy. And actually, if you have a strong economy, you know, everything else will improve because you can better invest in public services. So, yes, interesting that he divided it up that way. Bold in the fact he, as we've said, didn't do his speech on the final day. And also it kind of means that he must have such confidence in what he was delivering that he knew he wouldn't be overshadowed with any announcements on the NHS or any announcements on education, which in themselves are both really punchy, especially with what's going on in the news at the moment with the crumbling concrete in schools and the NHS and doctors' strikes. So interesting that was kind of the route and the tactic he decided to deploy. You're right, it shows a confidence that I don't think we have seen up to this point.
Yeah, and I guess a bit of a united team as well. And that's even though after Rachel Reeves delivered her speech as Shadow Chancellor, there was people say, oh, you're looking at the next leader of the Labour Party, the first ever female leader of the Labour Party, no less. And we saw the reaction from business was pretty strong. So we had the CBI there, we had Make UK, one of the trade bodies responsible for manufacturing in this country, and they were all glowing after they'd heard her speak. And that certainly was well received by pundits too. So that kind of went on into when we got round to Keir Starmer's speech and the structure of it. We had an introductory video as part of the preamble. Now we know that Rishi Sunak's wife introduced him to his speech, but with Keir we had a disabled parliamentary candidate as well, talking very passionately about public services from the heart, from my own lived experience, which I thought was pretty good. And then there was the rhetoric, which we'll come on to, that she led into. But then that video, continuing that theme, the conference theme of the team, featured. It was like a who's who of the Shadow Cabinet.
Yeah, it was. I was really impressed by the opener. We have talked about storytelling in previous episodes and how it's important to get your story out there because that is the hook that gets people interested. And that's what his intro guest delivered. She told us a story, took us on a journey. We didn't know the journey was leading to Keir. We were just introduced to a woman who was disabled. And then we found out that was Keir's mother. And then you've immediately got kind of empathy with him and with the situation, and so you're far more receptive as an audience to then listening to the messages that then come in. And I loved it. We haven't seen anything like this since David Cameron. He was kind of a fan of getting a parliamentary candidate or someone from a charity or a business to introduce him, followed by a barnstorming video of him meeting people from all around the country, which is exactly what we got from Keir Starmer. And then he came on to some very rousing music, and if I was an English student, I'd be having a field day with all the metaphors and the messaging and that was throughout the entire speech, because coming on to Lionheart's a pretty bold statement, don't you think?
Yeah, down with the kids as well, right? But yeah, you picked up on something there, which was this very reminiscent of the David Cameron style, and that's quite difficult to emulate because David Cameron was the great communicator. Keir's not been known for that. He's not been known particularly well for storytelling, apart from when he did that thing with Piers Morgan.
Yes.
Which we really got to know Keir.
And actually that was really good. And there's been kind of, and I don't know whether this has been deliberate, but there's been a complete then comms gap, I feel, between him doing that piece with Piers Morgan that kind of got us all hooked on. We really found out about him. And then there was nothing. And I suppose he's kind of got on with the task of sorting out his party. He's had a lot of work to do, and then coming up with surrounding himself with a really strong potential cabinet team, shadow cabinet team, and then pushing forward with a plan and some policies, off the back of a pandemic where things obviously were quite difficult. So we haven't really had that time of getting to know him, and I feel that actually the beginning of the speech and woven throughout his speech was kind of smattered with personal details, personal anecdotes, so you got to know him better, whereas Rishi Sunak relied entirely on his wife to tell everybody what he was like, and then he just did his speech and didn't refer to any of his own experiences particularly in the speech. And if we think back to Ed Davey's speech, he did do storytelling, but not until kind of over the midway point. And actually, you've probably lost a few people there. So I think the way he did it was really good. And I think I kind of felt the same excitement that I felt when you knew David Cameron was about to come on. You know, you've had this warm up. He even did the same thing of having people on the stage. And I think you and I have both been on Cameron stage.
We have been on a stage with David Cameron. Yes.
And, you know, it's quite interesting because no other leader has ever attempted to do it like that, certainly not since Cameron. Obviously Tony Blair was a fan of kind of having a few people on stage, but he kind of went for the cabinet team. I think it looks better if it is just ordinary people, because, you know, the cabinet have to be there, the shadow cabinet have to be there, it's not their choice. Whereas normal people, yes, all right, they're party members, so technically they're going to be at a conference anyway, but, you know, they're genuinely there hearing it for the first time, and it's their, I suppose, natural reaction to what's being said.
Yeah, I guess what we're talking about here is literal stage management. And we've seen various styles adopted, you know, from Ed Davies' speech without a lectern, which we spoke didn't perhaps suit his style, but he did do some good storytelling, just perhaps left it a little bit too late in his speech. And then being flanked by your cabinet team, that was kind of old school party conferences. We used to have the long desks that seemed to be built out of breeze blocks, and then you'd have a lineup of the team behind you. And David Cameron used to like to flaunt his team as well, a bit of a football team lineup on stage, or he'd be flanked by young Conservatives. That's clearly why we got pulled out of the crowd, because at the time we were very young. We wouldn't be pulled out of the crowd now, by the way.
No, we wouldn't.
Well, you might, but I certainly won't.
I'm not convinced I would be.
So that's stage management, the setting, you know, and we've seen that in the past. Theresa May's signage falling down behind her, you know, coming on Dancing Queen, all these kind of gimmicks, and Prime Minister's wives introducing them. But here we had is Sir Keir Starmer. It was a good bit of storytelling by the parliamentary candidate. Really loved that. The video I thought was really good. No words, just music, and it was like a whistle-stop tour around Britain. There he was. Oh, look, it was like Mr. Ben, wasn't he? Like he had one minute he had a hard hat, then he had high vis, then he had his sleeves rolled up, then he was in front of an aircraft carrier, then he was with Zelensky in Ukraine. Yeah, it was just a slideshow of activity.
And I think the video was important because he has come under quite a lot of criticism that he is a London bloke, and that seems to be kind of the biggest criticism anybody can give anyone. Oh, you're just a city Londoner, you don't know what the rest of the country's like. So I suppose by doing a video like that obviously shows you trekking around the length and breadth of the nation, actually it demonstrates quite literally that no, you aren't just in a London bubble. You do go out, you do meet normal people, you do kind of understand most people's life experiences, which I think is a really important message to get across, especially when conversely last week we had Rishi Sunak announcing that HS2 was cancelled in Manchester, of all places, completely not reading the room or in fact the city he's in. So it made a complete contrast to, you know, now Rishi Sunak, despite the fact he's an MP for Yorkshire, now he looks like the man that's locked in London and doesn't spend any time anywhere else in the country. Yeah,
and that was certainly something that Keir Starmer put into his subtle attacks on the Conservatives, which we'll come on to. But before we do that, and as Keir Starmer said then, possibly the biggest Union Jack behind him, focus on the red bit of the Union Jack, you know, in the city of the Reds as well, Liverpool, with the red team. That was quite poetic in terms of that stage management. But before we came on to his actual delivery, we then had a surprise guest. Didn't we?
Oh,
Who was that bloke?
Yeah, we did.
Who was that bloke? I'm not even going to mention his name. I mean, I've not even been bothered to find his name because clearly an attention seeker. But I think first and foremost, let's just talk about how on earth did a protester get that close to potentially the next Prime Minister of this country?
Yeah.
But the leader of the opposition got so close, in fact, that not only did he get within proximity, but he was able to pour something. That could have been anything. It was glitter in this sense, right? But it could have been acid, it could have been absolutely anything. I first thought it was Just Stop Oil, them up to their antics when they're not, you know, going to disrupt West End plays and whatnot.
Yeah.
or snooker, bizarrely. That I thought, oh, who's this character? But the fact that he got so close.
Yeah.
How on earth did that happen?
I mean, it's frightening. And I think actually, clearly security have dropped the ball there. But weirdly, he was a man, because I've had a slight look into this, who wants a people's parliament. It's as though he doesn't understand what the actual parliament is that is full of people. Baffling, but anyway, strange message, even stranger kind of protest to do. But it did allow Keir a moment of light relief. To be honest, there was a bit of humour which I think he used to his advantage.
And to be fair, it's happened before. Theresa May got handed a P45 by Simon Brodkin, the comedian, who I know we're big fans. That was quite funny, if a little bit cruel. It was cruel.
Yeah, it was cruel.
It was cruel. I mean, parody, satire, that's what he does. So it fitted with that. But yeah, it was cruel in the way that Theresa May gets, quite frankly, bullied.
She does, yeah.
So it was cruel in the context of that. But again, got close to the Prime Minister. How on earth?
Yeah, and you're right, she was Prime Minister at the time. Nobody should have been able to approach that stage.
No, and who gets held to account? Again, we never hear about this because it needs, and in an age where MPs are being murdered and are in fear of simply doing their duty and their service and their job, it's not good enough. So conference organisers, who we do engage with time to time, sort it out. Because this is not good for our democracy. It's not good for those that want to attend conference.
No.
And it's embarrassing. It's absolutely embarrassing. So sort it out. But there, this geezer, was chucking glitter over Keir Starmer, and this weirdly actually turned out to a bit of an advantage. So much so. Now, I am on the various political parties' mailing lists because I like to be nosy and keep an eye. I received an email from the Labour Party today inviting me to buy a T-shirt which was a Sparkle with Starmer. I won't be exchanging 20 of my UK sterling for a Sparkle with Starmer T-shirt, but if Labour Party want to send me one for free, then we're not sponsored, but I'll take one. But yeah, they were quick off the mark there. Pre-order, apparently. They're not ready to go, so we can see what they're up to there.
Yeah.
The cynic in me. But it actually turned out, and we do have this phrase, you and I, over the years, and the various politicians we work with,
yes.
I hasten to add, not aimed at the parliamentarians we've worked at, but particularly local government, that politics is all about not polishing a turd, but rolling it in glitter. Yeah. Now, Sir Keir, I know you love this show. We're not saying you're a turd, but on the glitter analogy, that was the only one I had, apart from the NAF T-shirt that someone tried to sell me earlier on today. But let's get serious again. That actually worked out, in terms of stage management, quite well for him, because he held his composure. It was at the start of his speech, one of the pivotal speeches this guy's got to give, possibly even the last speech before the general election.
Yeah.
But he held his cool. The jacket then came off. There was a lady that came on stage and advised him to take off his jacket.
I know what you're going to say. Sleeves went up.
The sleeves went up. Yeah, don't we love a politician? Oh, we love a politician when they roll their sleeves up, especially when they go into the NHS.
Because nothing says that I'm working hard than rolled up sleeves.
Plus, added it's like the golden triangle, add hard hat and high vis.
Yeah.
Sleeves rolled
Job
up.
done.
Job done. Hard working politician. But in all seriousness, he actually then referred later on in his speech, it was written into his script about the need to roll the sleeves up, and then he pointed,
already done it.
Already done that, mate. So it actually worked out, and he did inject a little bit of humour as well, and it gave him an opportunity in this aim to pivot the party from a party preparing itself for government to be serious, businesslike, away from the party of protest.
Yeah.
And he then referred to the protester and that whole notion of that we've moved on from that.
Yeah.
So really, it was quick. It really worked in his favour. But I had loads of anxiety about that glitter. Was it in his drink?
Water,
When he was taking his drink, I'm like, is it some kind of unicorn juice? unicorn juice that he was injecting. So I'm really worried for you, Keir, about what might have come out the other end. Did that sparkle? We won't know, but please do tell us. But it was a stunt that backfired on the protester, but completely ended up working for Sir Keir Starmer, and it was glistening in his hair throughout the speech, and he was able to refer back to it. So let's move on to the speech, and I'd really like to focus on, like with any speech, you've got to have a target audience, and it's very difficult in Conservative or Labour or the Lib Dem conferences, because you are trying to appeal to the masses and you're trying to appeal to your party faithful, but this is the only time that the national media care, and you're actually speaking outside of the audience as well. Now, I think 3 target audiences I'd like to pick up on are disaffected Conservatives, because he's going to need them, Scotland, and core Labour voters. The first one, let's pick up on disaffected, light blue Conservatives. Now, the Times picked up on this in an article, and they said it was at the heart of his message, and it was an appeal to disaffected Tory voters who found themselves looking in horror at the party's recent descent into the murkiness of popularism and conspiracy. And Labour, he said, this is, I quote, was the party that conserves, that fights for the union, the environment, the rule of law and fiscal stability. It is now the party, he suggested, of traditional Tory values.
Yeah, I agree. I think it'd be hard not to agree, actually. And listening to, we've already mentioned Rachel Reeves's speech, the economy has been heavy. That's what's come out of Labour. You know, HS2 was what came out of Conservatives, but the economy and stability is what has come out of the Labour Party conference. And there was so much in there that was for traditional Conservative voters. I mean, having heard a few snippets of Rachel Reeves's speech, I kind of thought, wow, is she a Conservative?
Yeah, some of the stuff he said, like about tax and spend, was exactly what Liz Truss said. So it was reminiscent of some Conservative messaging in the past.
Absolutely. And, you know, competitive tax regime, when at the moment, I mean, I'd say arguably, but it's just fact, you know, the biggest tax burden that the British people have had since the end of World War II, we're currently living under. And all of a sudden, Labour have said, actually, we can make this more competitive. When only last week, Rishi Sunak said, I'd love to do something on tax, but I can't.
Yeah, but they can, apparently. And the other thing as well, which was in that, was about the NHS. Yeah. And this kind of deification that we have around, and the hero narrative of the NHS. And he took responsibility about how we talk up the NHS. Now, I know, and you know from bitter experience, I've spent 4 years as an inpatient and outpatient, saving my leg. So my admiration for those that saved my leg is indescribable. So you've got a big supporter of the NHS here. But the thing, like with the armed forces, the hero narrative that we've seen transfer from the Afghan era of the armed forces over now to the COVID era of the NHS, I think is quite dangerous. And he acknowledged that. And he said he spoke directly about that responsibility of that language, which again I think does appeal to a lot of Conservative disaffected voters. I think it does. I think, you know, the NHS has got a lot of challenges, not just due to the pandemic, but, you know, various other factors as well. And traditionally Labour have, as he said, put the NHS on a pedestal as though it can't be touched. And I think, you know, by actually accepting that change does need to happen, you know, each individual NHS trust is delivering their services entirely different to the next one. And I think if he can bring in some of, you know, the good practice and share that across all areas, because you and I have both had family members that have had a tough time in the healthcare system, to terrible end result, frankly, the worst possible. And it's actually quite refreshing
for somebody to come out and say, look, this isn't perfect, and actually I want to bring in transformation, I want to bring in technology, we can do better. But it all starts with people. And actually, I think he recognises that people's morale, especially in the health service, but it is other areas as well, is low. I mean, he made a point of saying that the government didn't properly appreciate all of those who made sacrifices during the pandemic. And that isn't just people in the NHS, in my opinion, it's people all across, you know, the people who were working in the local shops and supermarkets that on a daily basis were kind of up against COVID. People who are responsible for, you know, working in the labs, who are working on the jabs and developing things. You know, you and I have got friends in that field as well. And yeah, the government has never really said thank you. In fact, my cousin who used to work in the NHS got a Kit Kat for her troubles during COVID. And you just think, you know what, we can do better. As a nation, you know, all right, people were whacking their pans, but that doesn't really mean much if, you know, you're going out there every day, does it?
Was that 2 fingers or 4 fingers?
I don't know. Actually, I should have asked.
It's very important. Very important detail.
Or was it a chunky?
Oh, Kit Kat chunky. Oh, now we're talking.
Yeah.
But he even used the R word when it came to the NHS reform.
Yes.
Again, bold. I think that's pretty bold.
Really bold. But again, that talks to kind of traditional Conservative voters that, you know, I think there's always room for improvement in every aspect of life. Where people are involved, nothing's perfect, is it? But actually politicians to recognise that, and instead of kind of going in with a sledgehammer, you know, he wants to work hand in hand with the NHS, he wants to seek improvement, was a really big step. I think he also said he's been working hand in hand with business, another huge tick for Conservative voters. Business is kind of the buzzword, wasn't really mentioned at all last week in Rishi Sunak's speech. But the fact that Rachel Reeves's, well, it isn't a budget, but, you know, her speech played so well to business leaders is clearly a good indicator that actually their brand of fiscal responsibility and stability, as Keir said, is the way business wants to move forward. Yeah,
and we got a sense of that with the reaction from the CBI and Make UK. I know, because I used to work at the Institute of Directors as a special advisor. Not as bad, those ones, but a different one. And they regularly meet with the business secretary. They'll meet with the opposition. So I think all eyes will be on the likes of the IOD, CBI, FSB, British Chambers of Commerce, all of those groups when they do joint letters. Yes. And there's something to look out as a bit of a way the wind's blowing from the business community.
Yeah.
But linked down, and we're going to delve into policy as well, and it was all about this mission-driven Labour government. He had 5 missions, and one of which, again going back to the appeal to the traditional Conservative, was around about breaking down the barriers to opportunity. So that everybody has a chance. So that kind of aspiration, he's definitely trying to steal the Conservative sandwiches, and he's making no bones about it.
And in fact, Rishi Sunak's wife said Rishi is aspirational. Did that come across in Rishi's speech? No, it didn't. And you know, there was no kind of travel forward on that, whereas Keir was like, actually, this is what aspiration looks like. You know, more kids going to university where appropriate, and I think increased number of technical colleges, I think was one of his announcements. You know, recognising that not every single person is academic, actually hands-on skills is what we need. And
that was linked to growth as well. So the kind of placement of, in the West Midlands, engineering colleges linked to automotive.
Yeah.
And he just then went through a shopping list of towns across the UK where you could link industry to education, which I thought was really good. And the other thing that he did was that aspirational story carried through from the storytelling he did at the beginning, introduced by the Labour parliamentary candidate, to his own storytelling, and that transcended through to that authenticity around policy.
We'll carry that forward still to the British dream of owning your own home, which
more chips so that he's stealing from the Conservatives.
And also, it's a bit of an odd one, isn't it? Because the Lib Dems had huge problems with that at their own conference. The membership were in favour of build more, yet the leadership were kind of hanging back a bit. The Conservatives didn't really make much headway on it, and obviously Keir Starmer's saying 1.5 million new houses. I don't know if he gave a time frame. Is that every year or in the next 5 years?
Is it part of this 10? Years? No, is this part of this 10-year programme?
Plan, maybe. However, everywhere you go, houses are being built. The problem is the cost of said houses. And unless that can change, and unless they do something about this whole affordability thing, because politicians love to talk about affordable homes, what do you mean, please? Because near us, there's a heck of a lot of house building going on, but they're 4-5 bedroom homes, executive homes. Who are these executives, please? And for those, how are they affordable?
And for those that are watching on YouTube, as you can probably gather from our kind of goggle box set up here in our home on our sofa, we are not living in one of those executive homes that Lydia speaks of.
No.
Who knows? If we can get this podcast going, really successful, big, more sponsorship, please. So that gives me an opportune moment. If you are enjoying this podcast on your earlobes at the moment and want to go and look at what we're up to on YouTube, then do head over to the Campaign Force Veterans in Politics YouTube channel, where you can become a subscriber. 90% of my viewers aren't subscribers, so clearly we're not doing a big enough job of pushing the podcast. So do hit subscribe whilst you're there. And also, don't forget you can support the show, not only by subscribing on your podcast provider, but if you go in the links, you can become a supporter. And that's for the cost of about, a sleeve of a Labour Party t-shirt, as advertised to me this morning, of one of Starmer Sparkles t-shirts. For the sleeve of that a month, you can become a supporter. And a whole t-shirt cost will almost cover you for the whole year. So do subscribe as well and become one of our supporters to keep the show going, so we can produce amazing content like this. Anyway, meanwhile, back at the ranch, let's go on to the other target audience, which was Scotland. And this was in one of his 5 missions as well, where he spoke about great British energy and harnessing clean power for good. And this kind of talks about the long-termism. It kind of, again, is a bit of a rebuttal about what we heard from Conservatives. And where was this going to be based?
Scotland.
And we know that Scotland's been very difficult for the Labour Party electorally. They've doubled their MPs in the last week because they won the by-election. They now have 2 Labour MPs in Scotland. But there was a time where they had 40 or plus MPs in Scotland, and completely wiped out by the SNP. So we're starting to see some early signs of that SNP fortress being chipped away by the Labour Party, and he will need those to form a government.
He will, he really needs to smash the SNP in Scotland. And he spoke about independence and how he thinks that the country is better together than it is in parts. And I think and as we know, all polling, all recent polling, especially for the last by-election around independence, that more people support Remain than Leave, as it were. So he's really pulling on those strings and hoping that actually he can get it over the line and get a huge increase in MPs in Scotland. I mean, he has to. He's got a monumental Conservative majority to overturn, and he has to start in Scotland. Winning the by-election was good progress, but they are going to need to move a lot quicker, because actually in the local elections last year, they didn't make as much headway in Scotland as perhaps they wanted to. Whether that was because of confused messaging, or because Nicola Sturgeon obviously was still leader of the SNP, and she was hugely popular regardless of what anybody thinks of her. She spoke the language of the voters in Scotland, and people voted SNP even if they believed in the union, because they liked her messaging and everything that she was kind of selling. So I think now they've changed leadership. that probably gives Keir Starmer a bit of wedge space between him and the SNP now.
Perhaps we'll see Gordon Brown rolled out on a roadshow like they always do as well.
Oh, I think we will, undoubtedly. Name any other Scottish Labour member that has a profile and they will be rolled out.
To be fair, I quite like it when Gordon comes out in defence of the union, because he does speak really passionately. He speaks a lot better than when he was Prime Minister, when he's kind of on the stump and out there on the ground talking about the union. So
well, you've hit the nail on the head. He's passionate about it.
Yeah.
And I think any politician talking about a topic that they're passionate about, that will come across. And it just kind of makes you buy into what they're saying, doesn't it?
Okay, so that's Scotland.
Yeah.
Done. Target audience number 2. Target audience number 3. Working people.
Yes.
And that was a phrase that he used. He used working class a couple of times. Well, I think it's almost a bit divisive as a term, working class, because people then sort of deselect themselves out of, oh, you're not speaking to me, I'm not working class. But working people has so much more utility, as transcends a lot of those class divides.
Well, most people are working people, aren't they? The majority of the country are working people.
Even people that do podcasts. As well.
Even us. But even retired people used to have a job. So he's talking to everybody, and the whole class thing, I think he's recognised, and we saw this was slightly the downfall of Gordon Brown. He made his entire campaign against Cameron and Osborne about class and how they were posh and they were this, they were that. And actually people don't buy into that, because most people genuinely are just going around about their day-to-day lives and don't see themselves in a class system. Obviously some people do. That's fine for them, but I'd say that most people don't. And also, if you were even to kind of go down that rabbit hole, kind of where would you put yourself? You know, a lot of people who have working class roots but actually now work in a completely different sector might still count themselves as working class, but would somebody who is at that grassroots feel that person was working class? It's such a difficult one.
I feel that's a bit of a dig at me there.
Not at all.
But I get what you're saying. And it therefore, because it's so personal about how people view what class they fall into, and class in this country is so deep rooted that I think he's avoided that.
He has.
That bear trap.
And it's wise, because he is a Knight of the Realm. And okay, that isn't particularly anything to do with class. That's obviously because of his time as Director of Public Prosecutions. But a lot of people wouldn't realise that. So I think, making it about working people, that applies to everybody.
Yeah.
You've suddenly got broad appeal, haven't you?
And it appeals not only broadly, but to his core vote as well.
Yes.
And that transcended into one of his missions as well. So we spoke about the NHS and reform, but then he also focuses on talking about paying the NHS staff properly and cutting waiting lists, which goes at the heart of his core voter strategy. And then that opportunity piece, we spoke about it has conservative connotations, but he really kind of contextualised it as a Labour offer as well, when he sort of did that kind of us and them comparison to the Conservative approach.
There was a lot of us and them. He did something quite clever early on and said, the government's been in power for 13 years. When Labour was last in government, it was things can only get better, whereas for the last 13 years things can only get worse, which was quite a clever play. Yeah,
there was that comparative analysis piece, but he did it also in a way that's different this time. In the past, I've kind of seen often it can be a bit sneery. It goes back to that class division thing, but he did it in a, dare I say it, a bit of a disappointed dad when it came towards Rishi and the gang. It was more of a disappointed dad. Yeah. And I thought that again was the tone of that was quite good.
But it's a clever tactic, because if you think, in 2019, Labour lost a lot of their seats that they had since basically the seat was created, all under Boris's kind of vision for the North, if we're specifically talking about the Red Wall. And so Keir can't be sneering at those people, because he needs them to come back and vote for him. He needs to win them round to his argument. So yes, there was considerably less kind of finger pointing and blaming, and a lot more kind of story around it, to make people also, I think, you know, oh, this story kind of resonates with me, I've got a similar experience. Oh, okay, so he understands where I'm coming from, he understands what my day-to-day life is like. Again, goes back to this whole, you know, he wants to be seen as someone who is kind of covering all corners of the United Kingdom, whereas conversely Rishi is seen as someone who's kind of very closed off, living in his Westminster bubble.
Yeah, and that sleight of hand about not sneering down on the Conservatives in that way, because if you are a disaffected Labour voter that did vote for Boris in the main in that red wall back in 2019, then you're not going to feel embarrassed by or belittled by the leader of the Labour Party, you know, having a go at you essentially by proxy. So I think being a bit of a disappointed dad enables them to perhaps feel that they can come back to the Labour Party. Yeah,
it's kind of an inviting hand back, isn't it?
It was. So I think that was another cleverness. So we've got the 3 target audiences there covered. The other, stylistically, going back to that element of Sir Keir's speech, I did notice he seemed to be a man that he was enjoying the cheers, but I saw normally his eye connection he has a bit of difficulty with, but he was almost trying to look at every single person in the room. There were lots of pauses where his eyes were moving around the room to connect with the audience. He used the word you a lot as well, rather than me, which always goes down well in communication circles. And normally when the crowd get overexcited and start cheering and shouting their man or woman on, they can then do that awkward pause, and then they end up repeating the beginning of the sentence that they've gone, and we saw that with both Ed Davey and Rishi. But with him, he kept speaking as they were cheering, and then he changed the delivery to then go up, and that's what we're going to do.
Yeah.
And he kind of adapted himself, and therefore it was a lot more flowy.
It was.
Which I thought was a side of him that we hadn't seen before as well.
Yeah.
So quite skillful in that. We mentioned some policy things, and that was kind of hooked around the 5 missions. But I think you said it was perhaps lighter on policy compared to the rhetoric.
Yeah, I felt it was quite policy light. There was a heck of a lot of storytelling, a lot of examples of where things have gone wrong for ordinary people, working people, we should say.
Not working class, working people.
Working people. So yeah, I felt there wasn't the level of policy that actually Ed and Rishi delivered. It was a bit lighter on that. Do I think that's a problem? Not particularly at the moment. I think he is probably on his ascendancy, and this is going to springboard him forward. So I would expect to kind of hear more going forward, unless he just kind of thinks that, as we mentioned earlier, all of the shadow cabinet have done their speeches. The policies in that, does he really need to kind of reiterate that? Which I'd argue yes, because as the leader of the party, your job is to basically summarise the conference and your policies into kind of one neat package and speech, surrounded by obviously all of the storytelling that makes it pertinent to people. So that's what I felt was slightly missing. How did you feel?
I think he gave it a good framework. The question is, so if he's got these 5 missions, the question is whether or not he's going to be consistent and have the stamina to continue this through over the next few months. And that framework will give others the freedom within his shadow cabinet team to kind of propel their policies forward and go into so round the media rounds during the week on the breakfast TV sofas. If they stick to that message, that might cut through. He's clearly identified, they've got a strategy, they've got a target audience strategy that's very clear, based around the core Labour vote, getting them back, disaffected Conservatives and Scotland, very clear. And it's whether or not they've got the consistency and the stamina to continue that through. I think he laid it out really well, the framework, and I'm kind of being a bit kinder on him in that policy lightness. I just think he's kind of set the stall up loosely, that will propel them going forward, but it's all whether or not they can keep that up.
Yeah, I mean, a year is a long time to keep momentum up for, isn't it?
It is. So it depends whether or not it is going to be a year. So he's kind of hedged his bets there a little bit, but we shall see. So let's give some bit of a scores rundown on the speech.
Can I say what I feel was missing first?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, you like to say what was missing.
I like to point out what I feel they should have said.
Okay.
So obviously we've said that he has had a go at the Conservatives and the SNP in a very nice way, mind. No mention of the Lib Dems. Absolute gaping hole.
They could be the kingmakers as well, right?
That's why.
Okay. So why didn't they mention it?
Well, because I think they're going to be the kingmakers. I think
he just avoided it.
Yeah, I think he's avoided it. His policy isn't to go after Lib Dem areas.
No,
from
not
what
after
he
their votes.
said. No, he wants to win back the red wall, and he wants to turn Scotland red again, and he wants to make some inroads in Middle England, given everything he said about talking to the Conservatives. No attempts to make any movement on any Lib Dem territory. No mention of Brexit, particularly, other than, it wasn't an oven-ready deal. But he's made no mention of that, although we've heard in the press that he wants to have a better relationship. I don't know what kind of that looks like. And no mention of the migrant issue, which obviously was a huge thing coming out of the Conservative Party conference last week. I think Ed Davey also touched upon it. Absolutely no mention by Keir on that issue and how he would deal with it.
Perhaps they've done some focus groups, and that issue they've just conceded to a certain wing of the Conservative Party where those voters live.
Yep.
And it's not as important to the Conservatives that they're trying to woo over. That's the only explanation.
Could well be.
Okay, I agree on all those points. But thank you for pointing that out before we moved swiftly on. My mistake. Right, let's go for where I was going to go.
Yes.
Which is kind of your... So was all that glittered glitter or gold when it came to Keir Starmer's speech? So let's go for style out of 10. So his style.
You know what? I really liked it. I'm going to give big. I'm going to give a 9.
9?
I'm going to give a 9.
Oh, so you are the Anton Dubek of
yes.
of this. I haven't looked at Anton's scoring, but I reckon he scores higher than the others. Just a nicer bloke, isn't he? And so let's go for substance.
Substance, you know what? I think his delivery and the content was really good. I'm a little bit disappointed that there wasn't more policy, but there was an okay level of policy. I'm going to give him an 8.
An 8. Length of speech?
Oh, it was another long one. I'm going to be honest. I don't know why they're all kind of heading towards the hour mark on their speeches. It was a bit long.
Definitely longer than this podcast. So you don't need to actually go and listen to the speech because
we've summarised
it within a palatable time period as well. We're there to serve, just like we're here to serve, just like politicians are. Okay, so that's interesting. And what would be your kind of highlight of the entire episode?
Ooh, my highlight.
What was the thing that really appealed to you personally?
I'm going to have to give that some thought, because actually there were quite a few bits in there that I thought, actually I quite like that. On the whole, everything he was selling I liked.
Okay, so perhaps you're that disaffected Conservative voter that he's going after. But do you know the bit we haven't mentioned, which appealed to me, was taking back Britain's streets. I think having just spent some time in Germany, where I felt really safe and was really clean and really secure. I'm not so sure I feel that all the time in this country.
No.
And again, it's a bit after normally seen as a traditional Conservative political issue, but taking back Britain's streets, what that means, we'll wait and see. But that was one of his 5 missions as well. So that was something that really quite appealed to me. Yeah,
that was good. I mean, you always bang on about what happened to the Keep Britain Tidy campaign.
I do bang on about that. Bring it back.
Needs to come back. Maybe that's what he's talking about.
Oh, let's bring that back. Yeah, I used to love that. And the little, the little person putting the rubbish in the little waste paper basket on packet crisps.
Cracking.
Yeah, we need some of that, especially around here. Brilliant. Well, that was an amazing summary. I think we've covered loads of ground today. And don't forget, if you have yet to subscribe to this podcast, it's a really easy and helpful thing you can do. That means that whenever we release new content, and we will be next week, as we return back to interviewing and profiling those that have served in our armed forces, that stood up to serve again in politics. I will be doing that again next week and the weeks beyond. We've got some cracking interviews lined up, got booking even more guests, and by subscribing to those, you'll be the first to hear when we have a new guest. And if you can support us, it helps put me on a train down to London to go and wheel around my microphone and go and interview MPs and set up our gear in Parliament. So that all helps us out as well, for the cost of about, I don't know, £3 a month, if that. And and YouTube is where it's at, kids. We'll be releasing far more content on YouTube, and you can head over to there and become one of our subscribers. Do not forget to hit comment as well. Let us know what you think in the comments section on YouTube too. But that's it from us. That's it from her.
Thank you.
Thank you as ever. We'll be getting more of Lydia back in future episodes when we have those behind the politics insights. But for now, that's us. And don't forget to stand up and serve again. Thanks for listening. Thanks to our guests, and thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, hit subscribe now. Alternatively, you can support our mission by checking out in the show notes below, where you can rate, donate, or become our mate. Thank you.